Great. All right. I'd like to start by saying Gurumba Bigi, and this is the language of the Yugarapu people where I'm sitting and coming to you from today in beautiful scenic Rim in southern Queensland. And welcome. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the First Nations custodians of the unceded lands we're all meeting on. And for me, that's Yugarapu. And I'd also like to pay my respects to people on the lands that you're all coming from. We're coming from different parts of Queensland and Australia, to elders past and present, and also to country. Thank you for your generosity, spirit, and teaching. And to our emerging leaders and First Nations colleagues that are joining today, may we work together in unity to create a world that supports all of us to flourish. And thank you for being here and prioritising our children, helping them to thrive in this setting, which is talking about disaster settings across prevention, preparedness, recovery and response, of course. So today, as you know, we're fortunate to have our guest speakers, Sharleen Keleher from the Queensland Centre for Perinatal and Infant Mental Health, and Brad Morgan from Emerging Minds. So both of these agencies, as you know, are well known and highly valued by all of us involved in the disaster management and also the allied systems in Queensland and across Australia, especially because of the wonderful resources, but also the leadership that helps us to develop as a workforce and also to create better informed and more inclusive policies and laws that make children and young people more visible. So they'll be telling us a bit about what they do, the resources, the information and the types of actions they're up to at a strategic level. And we'll talk about some of the impacts of disasters on infants, children, young people, on their social and emotional well-being, and how to build resilience and support kids and their caregivers' well-being in the context of disasters. So I'll just give you a bit of housekeeping that I've just mentioned earlier. The microphones and video are turned off because it is a webinar, but the session will be recorded. Please do use the Q&A function throughout the webinar as we go along. And as I've flagged in the Q&A already, we've got some tech and other support from my Thriving Queensland Kids collaborators there, Sophie and Camilla. So their contact details are in the web. So just a quick intro and context scene setting from me. While we're hosting these webinars, many of you will have attended the first webinar and so got the big picture of the Thriving Kids in Disasters project that I work with Jacinta Perry on. So the webinars, we're trying to increase attention and raise the visibility of the wellbeing and resilience of kids. So that's why Sharleen and Brad are great collaborators in this. They're a part of our journey from the beginning. That's a joint goal. And we really want to provide people involved in disaster management and allied operations with access to contemporary child and youth-centred practices, to people, to programs and resources. So that you've got some examples of how to do this. So when we did our Thriving Kids in Disasters grounding work in phase 1, which many of you are a part of, I just want to flag the frameworks that we used when we talked about wellbeing, especially for children and young people. So we referred to both of these frameworks, and we continue to when we're doing the work that we ourselves and others. So the NEST is possibly well known to you all, and that comes from the mothership of the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership group, which is the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. And that's the NEST that I'm sure the domains of wellbeing. It's a national framework for thinking about children's wellbeing. And specifically, we're talking about health, promoting good physical and mental health today. But that framework, as well as the one to the left, which is the national framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders social and emotional wellbeing, which just really flags the importance of connection with self at the centre and connection to body and behaviours, mind and emotions, family, kinship, country, culture, ancestors, spirit, as being really critical. So these two, as we travel along, please recognise that we we do think in that more holistic way. When we did review the evidence, particularly as it relates to infants, children's and young people's social and emotional wellbeing, these are the types of key messages that came out of our discussions and our look at what was already known, which is quite considerable, that all recovery activity should recognise, respect and build on the skills, knowledge, capacity, connections, needs and interests of individuals and families, but also the group services and institutions that they're already associated with, and that any actions or plans for responding to them, for providing services of support, should be informed by what we increasingly know has to be a nuanced understanding and agreement of what is needed by who, how it should be delivered and who should deliver it. So that's really going from a universal way of saying one size fits all to one that really recognises that people must be included in, because with their lived experiences of their own lives, their resources, what's possible, what they want. So, and I think both Sharleen and Brad are going to talk to us about that today. So, and a range of age and development appropriate supports across a spectrum of services is generally required. That's the kind of broader picture or theme that we know, and within that there's a lot of difference across place and time and people. And psychosocial recovery, like physical recovery, takes years. So there's been a lot of research, and Sharleen and Brad are among the people who have done that. So we're really very happy and grateful that they could share their information and knowledge with us today. These are some of the emerging bits of work that have informed our own and other thinking. And I'd just like to recognise and respect that a number of people who are involved in this research are online today. So I'd like to hand over to Sharleen to talk with us about all of the different amazing work that she does. Most people aren't good at talking up themselves, so I'll just say that she's the Early Childhood Education and Care Infant Mental Health Statewide Coordinator at Children's Health, as many of you will know. She did begin her career in education as a classroom teacher and moved on to also have great knowledge and skills in psychology, and recently completed her PhD, which focused on disaster resilience in early childhood education. And I know from talking with her that she loves bringing people together for the benefit of kids across that, especially across the health and education sectors. So over to you, Sharleen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm really happy to be with you all today, and it's lovely to see some familiar names, but also some new ones as well. So today I'm going to be talking about disaster resilience and recovery for babies and young children, and I'll be talking a lot about the work we do with Birdie's Tree, which some of you may be familiar with. I'll give you a little bit of context very shortly for those who aren't. So next slide, please. So I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting. I live, work and play on the lands of the Tarrabalang Bunda, Gurang, Gurang Gurang and Baili people. And I extend the respect to the traditional custodians of the lands on which you're all meeting from, and pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues online as well. Next slide. At QCPIM, we also, every time we begin a presentation, we acknowledge the value of the lived experience of the people we work with. We particularly, within the context of Birdie's Tree, we really value the learnings we have gained through working with communities across Australia who have gone through the experiences of natural hazards and disasters. So I would just like to stop here to acknowledge the value and contribution of lived experience to our work. Next slide. So, as I said, just really brief context for those of you who aren't familiar with Birdie's Tree. So it is an early childhood disaster resilience and recovery suite of resources and programs that was born from the experiences that across Queensland of a significant number of natural hazards and disasters that occurred in 2011. This suite of resources really began from that consultation with communities that were impacted by the flooding events in the Lockyer Valley, southeast Queensland, and up where I am in Bundaberg. And it was that recognition that there wasn't really any resources or things that people could draw on to talk to very young children about these big scary things that were happening, that were really confronting for us as adults, and especially so for our youngest children who were looking and seeing what was happening around them and needing that support from the adults around them to understand what was happening and to help them feel safe and secure and loved. So this led to a series of storybooks that were developed. Anita, we'll go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I mixed up the order of the slides in my head. So this led to a series of storybooks that began with Birdie and the Fire, and Drought, earthquake, all sorts of different hazards that occur. This has led to, I think the last book in our series to date has been Birdie and the Storm. It may be Birdie and the Shelter, which is around emergency evacuation shelters. And these books have all been driven by consultation with communities. We even have a book, Birdie and the Blizzard, which might seem really out of place in Australia, but this was in response to consultation with colleagues in Canada who experienced those kinds of events and really gave us that view around this can be really helpful at an international level, but also have some themes in the stories that may not specifically relate to that event, but it may have experiences and stories around something that connects with what the child's experiencing. It may also help them understand what's happening for other people across the world. Alongside this, we have our universal resources, which include the storybooks. We have a mindful movement program, a website which includes information for parents, emergency responders, and professional learning for early childhood educators, which is the work that I lead. Anita, if we can go back to that last slide, thank you so much. So Birdie's Tree we have a huge focus on that prevention, universal health promotion work, which includes those storybooks. We have visiting programs that visit early learning services, playgroups and schools, the early learning program. And these resources are designed to meet the needs of, we know about 80% of children will work through, cope with and recover after a disaster with the support of caring adults. So that universal level is designed to meet the needs of those children. We also recognise that some children will experience and present with post-traumatic stress symptoms, and within the universal level we have some screening that it helps mental health clinicians and educators identify those children who might need some additional support. And we have an early intervention program, and then in development, a trauma treatment program for the young children and families who might need an extra level more intensive support. Okay, thank you, Anita. We'll go 2 slides now. Perfect, thank you. So in all the work we do, we really recognise the importance of looking at disaster resilience as within this cycle of preparedness, response and recovery. We are looking at building the knowledge, the skills, the coping strategies, the resources that communities, early learning services, children and families can draw on if an event happens. So that's where we really focus in on building that through the preparedness stage. And then providing support through response and short-term and long-term recovery. We also, even though this slide presents like the circle seems quite linear, we really encourage people to keep in mind that most communities, if not all, have experienced multiple events, or they may be in a recovery from an event when another one occurs. This has been particularly relevant moving through those COVID years, where we have seen quite significant impacts of the COVID lockdowns alongside bushfires, floods, cyclones, and many other events that have simultaneously or in quick succession impacted communities. Thank you. Next slide. So I wanted to share one of the key things we're really focused on is increasing the knowledge and awareness of how babies and young children are impacted by disruptive events like disasters. This is an area where, as particularly mental health clinicians and educators recognise that there's some really good knowledge base there, but sometimes, particularly in the area of trauma, understanding how a very young child presents when they've experienced these stressful events and potentially presenting trauma responses, what that actually looks like. So the common reactions that we see in babies and young children after a disruptive event include emotional responses, including sadness. You might see an increase in clinginess or separation anxiety, or you may see the opposite of that, where you see children being overly removing themselves from their caregiver. You may see children going backwards in previously developed skills. This can include things like toileting is a very common one, where children have previously been toilet trained and they regress and need to go back into nappies or need support in toilet training again. Feeding. We also see sleeping problems. This can be sleeping more or less. You may see emotional outbursts or temper tantrums, and you may see new or increased fears and worries. And these may be directly related to their experience, or it may be related to an interpretation of, or the child's interpretation of what was happening and what their community was facing. I want to put a caveat in here that all of these responses can also be a very normal response to a stressful or disruptive event. When we see that this is of a concern is particularly when these reactions continue over time. We normally say 4 weeks or more, or they increase in severity, or the reactions and symptoms are causing concern and distress for the family and the people around the child. Next slide, please. We also acknowledge that the children are not the only ones who have been impacted by this experience. The adults around them also have, and it's really important to keep in mind that there are these kinds of responses that are, again, can be a very natural response to a stressful, disruptive event. And we need to keep in mind and check in with each other around if these things are happening, what kind of support could the person need? When we talk about a baby or a young child, we always talk about them in relation to their relationships, the people around them. The children look to the adults around them to know how they should feel about the event. How bad is it? How worried should I be? And if the adult is distressed, the child is more likely to be distressed, and vice versa. And there is a strong relationship between parental mental health symptoms and child mental health symptoms following a stressful event. It's really good to keep in mind that this can be a valuable way of connecting with the child and modelling how to respond when you experience a challenge. So acknowledging your own feelings and validating the child's. So things like, yes, I really understand you're feeling sad. I'm feeling sad too. And showing children how to manage these feelings, staying calm and being kind, and modelling looking towards the future with hope can be really, really helpful in these times. Next slide, please. So we have on this slide some of the risk factors that are known to influence children's experience and response to a disruptive event. So there are pre-existing event-related and post-event factors that all interact to influence the child's perceptions, thoughts, and feelings about what's happened. Some of these factors have been identified as posing a higher risk for ongoing mental health issues following a disaster. I wanted to particularly note that many of the risk factors, particularly those that are event-related or after the event, are relational in nature. This really highlights the importance of supporting and developing secure and responsive relationships to support the children to navigate the challenges they may face in their lives, including natural hazards and disasters. Next slide. So, I could talk about this for ages, but in summary, what we know helps young children to process and cope with big feelings that might be associated with a disaster, talk, play, and storytelling. The key messages we want to convey are the importance of creating time and space to talk with children of all ages about what's happening around them, how they feel about these experiences, and supporting their agency in making sense of what's happened. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the area that I lead in Birdie's Tree is the early learning program. This program is designed to support early childhood education and care services to embed disaster resilience education in their everyday curriculum and provide practical strategies for disaster preparedness, response and recovery that are informed by the needs of babies and young children. Since 2019, I've been conducting an ongoing evaluation of the early learning program. And this evaluation is a mixed method study. It's been evaluating the implementation of the program across over 200 early learning services across Queensland and New South Wales. The program is based on an overarching model of face-to-face workshops and online modules, but has also been adapted to more condensed delivery modes that are based on the needs of the organisation and service that we're working with. And for the rest of the presentation, I want to focus on what the educators' experiences were to show the evaluation findings. Next slide. So in 2022, we had over 100 educators from 6 Good Start centres participate in the early learning program after the Northern Rivers floods. A key theme from their experience was the importance of working together at various levels: organisational, community, with colleagues and with families that supported their recovery. At the organisational level, Good Start provided clinical supervision for their centre directors through one-on-one support with a mental health clinician, helping them to manage new challenges and prioritise their wellbeing. Group sessions with art therapy and collegial support were also offered through this supervision. At the community level, as you can see on the slide, the centres became hubs for donations, with centre directors managing the logistics of distribution. Centres outside the region also provided support, like chocolate hampers for Easter. At the centre level, consistency for children was prioritised, even when the centres were closed. Educators set up systems to maintain routines, such as allowing children to bring their own lunches to centres where meals were typically provided. This happened in the context where we had several centres who needed to go to one centre, so they maintained the routine from their home centre. Next slide, please. Children's play is a key way that they process events like floods and other natural disasters. Play allows children to express their emotions, experiment with the stories about what's happened, and develop their understanding of the world. The educators really focused on their observations of the children's responses and the themes that were occurring in their play. And they played a role in helping the children's parents and caregivers understand what the normal responses to stressful events were for the children, and also how to talk about those things that they were seeing that were confronting, both either for the child or the family. Next slide. So there were so many examples of ways that educators supported the children's understandings of what happened with the floods, including emergency planning, such as storm drills, and how can you do that in a way that meets the needs right from the baby room up to the preschool room. How they could learn about weather and what was happening as we moved through that year, particularly when we saw rain coming. What do these heavy, like grey clouds mean? Are we safe? What do we need to do? And they included preparedness activities inspired by the Pillowcase project. I always point out, but it's my favourite one. On this particular one, we had a young boy who wanted to have a shower, a portable shower with GPS tracking on it. So you could get yourself clean if you needed to evacuate, but also make sure you knew where people were. Next slide, please. And another thing that the educators particularly focused on is that the disasters don't happen in isolation. Children experience daily stresses, and for some, the flood was one of many challenges. This was an opportunity to look at the strengths and resources available to support the children and their families through adversity. Next slide, please. So this slide tries to capture really quickly an overarching summary of the evaluation findings that I published in my PhD thesis, focusing on professional learning and early childhood disaster resilience education. The diagram on the left shows factors that influenced educators' engagement with the professional learning program. So things like structural factors, like the design and delivery of the program, the content that was covered, and the organisational support provided. And incredibly prevalent theme was around the time and competing priorities that educators experienced, and factors related to the ECEC workforce context, including transition, the transient nature of the workforce, and many other things. Sorry, I won't go into too much detail there. Other findings included a consistency in the ways educators used the Birdie's Tree storybooks, aligning with their existing teaching practices. So it wasn't an add-on, it was combined within their current teaching practice. The value of focusing on place-based and contextualised practices, and the importance of connecting with educators' existing commitment to supporting emotional wellbeing of young children, collaborating with their community, connecting through relationships with their families, and engaging with children as active agents in their own learning. Next slide, please. So there were many recommendations, but just the two that I wanted to highlight was around the need for professional learning for educators and teachers to build their knowledge and skills around disaster resilience education, and needing to be a national education workforce development priority, particularly in the context of Australia, where we've experienced so many events over the last few years. And the importance of infants and young children being considered and included in disaster preparedness, resilience and recovery policies and procedures when they are still, we've seen many improvements in this. However, we've got a long way to go. And I know Brad's going to be talking about some of the amazing work Emerging Minds has been doing to advocate for young children to be considered in disaster management. Next slide, please. So if you haven't come across Birdie's Tree and you would like to, our contact details and website are on the slide here. But to just finish up, I wanted to share just a couple of, some words from some of the wonderful educators we've worked with over the years. So Alex, who is the director of Lismore Preschool, said, by providing a range of different ways children can express or come to understand events like the flood, children are given the opportunity to share their feelings and their understanding. Equally important is to consider the partnerships that exist with parents and allow them time and space to also share their experiences. And Susie, who is the Centre Director and Lead Educator at Korakai CWA Preschool, said, having a safe environment which includes familiar staff for the children and families is vitally important. Also, by not having expectations about the recovery journey and taking this alongside the children and families has certainly given us valuable knowledge and experience. When we shared our own journeys, no matter what they were with the children as they approached us, the journey they were travelling no longer meant they were alone with their families. Whilst we didn't want to normalise the flood and what had occurred, we did need to work through each person's journey and allow them the time to process how they were feeling, give these feelings a name, and then assist them to manage these emotions. Children, like adults, can be very strong if we give them the chance to be. It will never be an easy ride, but we certainly hope that the connections and support we provided may make their road a little smoother. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you so much, Sharleen. There's some claps for you, well deserved. So at the moment, we don't have any questions, but let me just encourage everyone to write things down as we go along. So a lot of the information that Sharleen presented really resonates with the broader talk about recognising the importance of children's existing relationships with their families and caregivers, of course, but also with the carers in the community, which include the Early Learning Centre teachers and schools, and recognising how busy and already in some instances at capacity or over capacity they are. So the importance of actually integrating or combining it, this new or additional resource through preparedness, which may well become possible with recovery funding. But being able to do that is really critical, and people have pointed that out time and again. So unsurprisingly, Sharleen's one of the people at the forefront of doing that. So it's very practical, and those resources address a whole range of people, not just the early years folk who do that as a profession, but families. And the work that Emerging Minds and Brad and his team do really continues on this theme for a broader age range, I guess, across the broader scope of Australia. But both Sharleen and Brad are involved in and drivers, I think, of the National Infant and Child Disaster Mental Health Advisory Committee. I did write that down because it's a lot of, I think you might hear it called NICDAC because we love acronyms. So it's just that combination of being able to give these practical evidence-based resources and hands-on support to different people in our system while also advocating and making change at that strategic level. So thank you, Sharleen, and thank you also, Brad, for doing that. So Brad, I'll just say Brad's the Director of Emerging Minds, and he leads the delivery of national infant, child, adolescent and family mental health strategies, and does that in a couple of ways, but including the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health and the Children of Parents with Mental Illness Initiative. And he, I know, is committed to that, the idea that, as Sharleen is, of bringing together practice and lived experience and the expertise and knowledge that lies there with research to support design and delivery of promotion, prevention and early intervention strategies that improve the mental health of infants, children, young people and their families. So, and he leads systems change. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Brad.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks, Sharleen, as well. Oh, can you hear me now? Yep, good. Thank you. Yeah, I think today I'll be talking a bit more about some of the work that we've been working with many of you, but also with many people across the country around how do we support children and carers and caregivers in response to disaster. A bit like the theme today, I think we're all challenged to always think about how do we translate what we know into what that looks like for children and families on the ground into practice. And but before I get started, I do want to acknowledge I'm joining you from Ghana country today. So I'm based in Adelaide in South Australia, which is where I live and work and play as well. And want to acknowledge the local connections and importance of those connections to land, culture and spirituality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people where I live, but also across the country. But also just to highlight the artwork we had here done as well, which was done by an Aboriginal artist, Susan Close, here in I guess sort of at the centre of that circle is the child. And just like we've probably heard about, is around that child is that network of environments, culture, spirituality, people, relationships that nurture and support infants and children's wellbeing and development. And I think that reflects what we're talking about today as well, is the importance of that environment, both physical, relational and cultural for children's wellbeing and development as well. But just moving on to the next slide, for those of you that might not be familiar with Emerging Minds, we're a national infant, child and adolescent and family mental health organisation. And we're based mostly in Adelaide, most of our staff, but we do have staff in teams around the country, including in Queensland as well. Really, our purpose and goal is how do we improve nationally the infant, child, adolescent, family mental health. And I guess some of the ways we look at doing that, as you can see on the slide here, is we do recognise that the interactions and behaviours and of the workforce, but also the community towards children and families are impacted by the systems in which we live, the context that we live. And sometimes those systems and the ways we interact are shaped by design. So policies and programs and practice guidance, but sometimes those variables in our lives, and in particular in practice lives, make our interactions with infants and children easier. And sometimes they make them harder. And so for our work, we're really looking at all of those layers you can see in those colours there of what's happening in each of those levels that enables or gets in the way of how we can support infants and children. And so our ambitious task, along with many of you, is to sort of work together around how do we change those variables across all those levels to make delivering support for infants and children and young people easier, expected as well, expanded as well. We know there's some gaps in the level of workforce and supports that are available, but also equitable. We know that not all children in every community have the same level of support as well. So that real importance, focus on equity. So what does that mean? I guess sort of an area for our work is we do look at disasters, and the reason we look at disasters is that really long history of understanding of what disasters can mean for infants and children. And so our work in this space is really to look at how do we increase visibility of infants, children, young people and their caregivers in disasters. Also looking at some of those systems changes, as Anita mentioned before, and I think many of you are aware of, is how do we actually learn from what has been experienced from children and families, practitioners, researchers, communities. There's a really long history. And for some communities, that dates thousands of years of managing and living through disasters. How do we garner that knowledge and share that so that when we do experience another disaster, we're actually moving forward and progressing understandings and learning from what we've previously understood and experienced. And as I said, our ambitious task is to translate that knowledge and make it practical and accessible to all of the different people that connect and support infants and children in disasters. When we're looking at disasters, I might go to the next slide. We are very much framed, as I sort of said, around that systemic approach to child mental health following disasters. And what this really means is we're really asking ourselves, what is the system or network of supports that's needed to best support infants and children? We know from evidence that it's not a single program, not one single activity that can cover all needs. I think that was mentioned before, is the needs are so diverse. And so we need to look at, if we're looking at a place-based level, what are those different systems and core components of those systems that are needed? And I think within our work, we're seeing some of those systems changing as well. I think it was mentioned before, but we all know what we've experienced over the last few years. There's a change even in our experiences of disasters where the frequency and the accumulation of those in some communities has really challenged us to think differently as well, even around the flexibility we need to be able to adjust and respond what we previously knew and experienced in disasters. So that systems response is really thinking about what do we need to put in place around the community, knowing that there's multiple things we'll need to support infants and children. And as you all know, there's so many people that get involved in disaster preparation. Sorry, there's a dog running around me going, a little bit excited at the moment, but we know that so many people are involved across that disaster sort of preparedness during immediate disasters, and some people find themselves there without expecting to find themselves there, alongside those that are supporting the recovery in the short and long term. And so for us, it's sort of thinking about what do we need in each of those stages, and that's sort of what we've been really exploring. I'll quickly skip over the next slide just to highlight, as I'm sure many of you are aware, when we look at the evidence that we need to gather is from many different sources. If you do a lit review, you'll know that that only gets you so far around the detail and specification of what's needed. But also in disasters, there's so much meaningful knowledge that exists within communities and within practice that isn't documented, and that's the importance of that collaboration with communities, with the networks, and that's has been our role, is really connecting and understanding what does this look like, what does this feel like. If you were to describe what to do, what would that be? So that's been our role, is really bringing together all of those sources of evidence and continuing to. I think this is always going to be an ongoing process for us as we gather this information. But as I mentioned, as our work sort of goes into looking at systems and practice, change is really important. And the reason I put this on here is just to highlight that we can't just pay attention to one or the other to contribute to outcomes. Systems change and practice change is what it's a big word, I guess, is bidirectional. They influence each other. And I'd say in disaster space, we do have lots of systems and policy and guidance needed to support us, but also there's so much knowledge and wisdom that exists in practice. And sometimes they marry up and sometimes they don't. But really they should have this relationship where they're connecting with each other. And the outcome of systems change and practice change happening in parallel that's what supports changes for children and families on the ground. So over the last few years in our work, we've been connecting with those that have been doing work for decades in this area of work as well, around what can we do to improve responses to infants and children in disasters. So we've undertaken lots of tasks, as I said before, connecting, consultations, understanding from families, from practitioners, from first responders, from policy, from researchers, educators, all of those groups around what's happening. And I guess moving on to the next slide, what have we found? And that's what I'll talk about today, is some of the findings from all of the discussions and connections we've had. Is we know in Australia we have some really significant world-leading efforts and actions that are being undertaken. And what we also know, though, is that those actions are in pockets. And we just had an example of a really important example of that action being taken. What we don't have is a comprehensive system of understanding of what are those practices that we should expect and work towards happening, and what are those actions across the full systems of connections and support that support children, infants and children and families in disaster. What we found through our work, and is very familiar, and I think that was sort of a big overview there, but really just to say, we do know that disasters can, and they do have an impact on infant and children's mental health and wellbeing and their development, both in the short and the long term. But it depends on many, many variables around what that impact is. And sort of what we can sort of see here is different examples of how infants and children respond. You know, for a portion of our community and for infants and children, they do recover with support. But for some children, that will take a little bit more time and a little bit of extra support. And for some other infants and children, the impacts may be quite persistent and ongoing and may actually worsen following disasters. And so when we're thinking about systems of response, we need to be thinking about all of those children that have different responses. And there's many variables that impact on that. So what was the community like before the disaster? We know that there's pre-existing issues that impact on children's mental health and wellbeing and development in communities before a disaster. What happens in the lead up to the disaster around preparedness, what was the infant and children's actual experience of the disaster in their family, but also what happened afterwards, and what types of support are there, and what are the ongoing consequences for infants and children directly, but also what are the consequences on their caregivers and those educators as well that often lived through the similar experiences as well. And when we think about that and we think about children's development, we think about children's development as what happens in their everyday lives. And so that's what we really want to pay attention to, is what's happened and what's changed in children's everyday lives that we need to pay attention to. So that's sort of one, obviously, key message and finding is it depends. I think for us, it's an important message for everyone, is that there's no unified sort of set of needs necessarily for every single child. It really does depend. What else did we find? So if I move on to the next slide, when we're looking at that structure I showed you earlier, we do know there are examples of where infants and children and young people and their families' needs are specifically addressed in policy, and that's getting better, but we also know there's a lot of examples where they aren't. And so when we're looking at policies, quite often we see a very generalised discussion of principles or actions that need to be taken, but what we know in infants and children and young people is the importance of a developmental lens, that how you enact those actions actually require us to look at what needs to be done developmentally at different ages and stages, but also for different groups of children and families. And so in response to that, we have formed a National Infant Child Disaster Mental Health Advisory Committee, and that really brings together a range of stakeholders nationally and across states and territories as well, really to help us sort of formulate and develop a shared understanding actually as a group around what those needs are. All of us come from different perspectives, from different sections of research, from emergency management, health, mental health, child development. So even ourselves having to have a shared understanding of what those needs are and sharing our different ideas about that is important. And so that's been a big focus of our work over the last couple of years, is looking at policies and looking at evidence and looking at even our approaches to participation with children and families as well. And the real goal of some of our work, and I'll go to the next slide, is we also heard from a lot of people who are tasked with the responsibility of responding to disasters, of designing responses, is that I also don't, there's nothing telling them necessarily how do I navigate all of these steps and processes. There's some core principles that exist, but what they mean for infants and children wasn't necessarily clear to them. And so a lot of people have been trying to figure that out. Fortunately, they're figuring out has enabled us to identify from what they've learned some core practices that I guess we're working towards a shared agreement nationally that these are the actions that are examples of how these principles can be applied across a whole range of areas. And so that's what we've been working on, both for policy, but also for those leaders that are tasked with that responsibility for making decisions with communities as well. So I'll move on to the next slide just to highlight one of the actions that we're taking, and I guess what we're inviting to support action to be taken from those leaders and those policymakers is we're working on a process of developing principles and actions, which really is about what are core principles around disaster preparedness, response and recovery, and how do they specifically apply to infants and children, and then what are the recommended actions that can be taken. And so I think this has got a few sort of steps in it, Anita, so I'll just be, if you're happy just to steps through these quickly. We won't need to go through each of them, but just to say we've been working with a whole group of many stakeholders to refine and review existing policies and guidance that exists around disasters, and working on navigating, and if you want to just keep skipping through and again and again and again for a little bit longer, lots and lots of consultations to the point where we're formulating a set of core principles and actions that will form as a national document that we're seeking a number of organisations to, I guess, endorse and support, to say this is, and governments as well, to say these are the core actions and principles that inform that we need to be taking to support infants and children and families in disaster. So I'll move on to the next slide. And one of the areas we're also cautious and conscious of in our work is we don't want those principles to sit as vague principles that often don't result in action. We know that's sort of one of the challenges is people agree with those principles but don't necessarily know how to put them into action. And we don't want to be prescriptive, but I think what we also know from our work is across practice, we know there's a lot of really, as I said, world-leading sources of knowledge about infants and children and how to respond, but what we also know is it's quite specialised areas of knowledge. So lots of people with specialist knowledge, but not necessarily that's filtered through to a lot of the other workforces that are connecting with children and families. And so something we have been undertaking is sort of trying to look at what are measures across for different workforces, what level of knowledge they have around children's mental health more broadly and trauma, but also we recently did a survey that included some specific questions around how confident people feel responding to children in disasters. And so if I go to the next slide, what you can see here in the blue is how people rated themselves as feeling their level of competence and capability in responding to infants and children and families in disaster. What you can sort of see there is a number of domains that we looked at in mental health capabilities and trauma capabilities across different workforces, ranging from general practice health, social services to first responders. What we can see across that sort of area, pretty much just to say that there's pretty low levels of competence and capability in relation to disasters specifically. We can see some moderate competence around some other areas. But also probably just building on what we just saw before in the previous presentation, the two lowest levels was the younger the child is, the less capable we felt across workforces, but also disaster capabilities as well were rated pretty lowly among our workforces, despite, I know, all of the efforts that we've all been putting in place. So I'll move on to the next slide. So in response to this, and also to align with that principles and actions, if you remember my slide, systems change and practice change equals changes for families, we've been working on what are the practices that we need to be supporting to be shared across workforces and developed so that hopefully we can see that competence increasing in future, which we will sort of start measuring over time. And so a couple of my colleagues, along with Michelle Roberts, who many of you are aware of, but I do have a shout out to colleagues who've recently moved on, which is why I'm presenting today rather than them, but Ben Rogers and Ruby Oram as well. They've had the enormous and ambitious task of connecting with many of you and many sectors around what can we learn about those different phases of disaster and experiences of disaster and the actions that are taken for infants and children that we can scale up and share nationally. And so what we've developed is a practice guide, and what I've got here is the list of practices and examples across different sections, and each of these is a beast in and of itself, and so there's going to be a big translational task that we've got ahead of us as well. But just to say what this guidance will provide is for systems, but also at an individual level, different examples of how those that find themselves in particular circumstances as adults in children, supporting infants and children across disasters, opportunities, but also the best practices that we've been able to identify through evidence reviews, but also from those on the ground, including children and families, around what to do during disaster. And so that practice guide, I think, is coming out at the end of next week, the first round of that. But as I said, there'll be a big translational implementation piece to follow, which is certainly something we're keen to connect with many of you on as well. So really excited to be able to share that with you shortly, but just to say that's coming very shortly. As I said, this is a really important, I guess, piece of work around the systems change and the practice change and trying to bring those together in the future. So we'll be certainly connecting with many of you and I guess sort of learning in these first few months of when we release this, ways that we can help this to happen and really partnering with you to support this to happen. So move on to the next slide, which is just me reinforcing what I just said. So yeah, that'll be available very shortly. But as I said, it'll be quite a big guide that'll sit online and be freely available. But we do anticipate, and we've got another couple of years at the moment, we'll be testing out different ways for us to disseminate this nationally, but also what does this mean on the ground, and really keen to collaborate with partners around how do we scale this up locally. So if you are interested in connecting, I'm sure Thriving Queensland Kids is certainly going to be a key partner in this in their work and supporting that to happen in Queensland. So we're really keen to collaborate with them and also the networks as well that exist in Queensland who are already doing so much work in this space too. And then most importantly, I think in this sort of area is what are families actually saying and what are their experiences of disasters and what can we do to support them? Obviously, there is the practice and the networks of support that wrap around them, but something we also heard for families is quite often they felt unsure what they could be doing as well. They felt like sometimes they have to wait for someone to give them permission to take action in supporting infant and child mental health. And the consequence of that is often they'll delay seeking help or delay getting access to help as well. And so we've been working with families as well to go, what can we share with you? What makes sense to you around all this knowledge that's been gathered around some ways that other families have navigated some of these tricky times, particularly if they haven't been able to access support as well. And so we've been doing a lot of work with families with lived experience of disasters, and formed this year a advisory group of families as well, who've been working alongside us with the practice guide that I just mentioned and systems change, but also working with us to develop some specific materials or linking with materials that exist for families as well. So I might go on to the next slide. And I think this quote here I've put on here, and I think reflects something that we've sort of continue to be challenged with, and that I think a lot of sector and systems are challenged with, is how we view infants and children. And quite often we view them as individuals who are sort of sitting in isolation from context and from relationships. And I think that comes from often we put an adult lens on how we view children, where I think what this reflection from someone who experienced a disaster was able to say, I was getting help for me as an adult, as a parent, I was getting help for my children, but no one was helping us with our whole family and what our whole family needed and the impact it had on our relationships with each other. And I think that's sort of important. I think flagged in the Thriving Kids in Disasters ideas is important attention to the role of parents and caregivers as well as children, and that connection between them in the work. The other quotes I've just got here is just different examples from families around what it's felt and looked like, but also when they've come to realizations themselves around what children needed in the context. You can sort of see here that devastation of our own emotional impacts as adults, of seeing what's happened around us, but then zoning and going, oh, actually, what do our children need? Sometimes our own grief and sometimes our own experience of disaster can sometimes get in the way of how we're feeling about noticing what our children are needing as well. And so it's that realization, what can we do together? And some of those strategies, I think, that were mentioned in the previous presentation, what we can do to support our own children and families through this. Next slide. Just examples of what parents have been sharing around what they've been learning and how they've gone about trying to understand their children's needs. And once again, their kids actually saying, and I think you'll hear this from practitioners, is kids are worried about their families as well. They're worried about their parents. And so they sort of need a sense of, I need to know mum and dad are going to be okay just as much as people want to pay attention to how I'm going. And so once again, that reinforcing message of that interconnection of the whole family's experiences of the disaster, but also what happens to families afterwards and paying attention to that, because we know the disaster experience itself is important, but it's what happens afterwards as well, just in relation to the stress of rebuilds or what this means for employment and things like that as well for families as well, as a really important factor impacting their daily life. But also I think something I'm really conscious of in our work as well, and the messages we send to communities as well, is with best intentions, we can prepare people, but sometimes we're just not prepared because of what the experience was. All of the things we thought we were going to do just didn't happen. And so for us, there is an element of preparedness, but also realization in families that even though I didn't feel prepared, I feel really bad about that, getting trapped in the guilt of that. So there is some dynamics, I think, around the messaging and communication we have with families we really need to be conscious of too. And obviously children has been involved in this as well. And I think a key message from children is don't make assumptions about what our experience was. Quite often, even we hear that from parents and from educators, is what they've noticed about what children have experienced and what they're worried about children experience versus actually children go, it wasn't that I was worried about, it was this moment, this experience that concerned me. So just creating that dialogue and opening that up as well. And the results of some of this work with families that we're doing is, in addition to sort of the practice resources and the guidances, we're also working with many of you around how do we disseminate what's already available for families, but also developing a hub as well, which includes disaster-specific resources for family members as well, particularly parents and caregivers, including how they can support children preparation during and follow up to disasters as well. So that hub, there is some materials already available and will become more available that are freely accessible, but we're also working on what's called a guided self-help hub, which is sort of, I guess, going a bit deeper and what we hope practitioners can use when they're working alongside families to provide some guidance on some ways that they can navigate disasters as well. And things I just want to flag also when we talk about children and families, this is from some of our other work, but what we have noticed is a real attitude shift to promote across policy and across adults connecting with children, is we actually do need to change the way we view infants and children. And many of us are doing lots of work in this area, but it's always good to know that we could be doing better, is quite often when we think about children, we often have a particular picture in mind of what their capabilities are or what a child is. And what we're really doing is helping people to think about what is a child and what knowledge and wisdom and context that they have and the capacity to contribute. And so we've sort of got this just as a way to sort of think about how do we help people think differently about what capabilities of infants and children in disasters, as well as in the broader community as well. And we've just got examples of that on slide as well as an important part of the process of how we understand, connect with, and support infants and children as well. And that's sort of me finishing up just to sort of say, yes, I know this is a big ambitious task that we all set ourselves upon, but just to say that the efforts I think we're all contributing to and networking together around these needs is such an important part of supporting, I guess, what we would identify as that real ideal system of supports for infants and children. It is a bit more complex, but I think all of us are aware, and I think we've got good examples in disaster practice of how to connect, and I think probably really good examples, those issues of the environment and the context we live, as well as how does that support and wrap around infants and children. And I think that might be all for me, but just to say, we do have some existing resources, as I said, the Community Trauma Toolkit and the Family's Disaster Resources. If you haven't yet, I will give a plug just to say you'll find out, and we'll be communicating with the sector very shortly about the practice guide I mentioned in the next couple of weeks. But if you haven't signed up to our e-news, certainly do. That will be a big feature of that in the next couple of weeks. But also those principles and actions. We've got a meeting with the national group in a couple of months, and that's really to refine those a bit further. But really, I guess we're viewing this as a shared document, as all this knowledge is. This is a shared knowledge that we all hold together. And so we're really wanting to bring that together and I guess give people ownership over the materials that we've developed with you so that you can use these to the best of your ability in disseminating and building capacity to support infants and children in disasters.
Thank you so much, Brad. I just want to give a shout out to people online. This is a great opportunity. We've got about 5 minutes that for you, if you want to. I've just posted a question there. What are great things you're seeing and doing to support kids and caregivers, and also what challenges are you facing, and even what's resonating with you. All of those things are helpful for people like Brad and Sharleen to know and hear, given that they're at that national level influencing practice guides and policies. I'll just give some space. Here's some new posts coming up. Holly, hi Holly, would it be possible to get these slides or have the QR codes emailed? I haven't asked Brad and Sharleen for permission yet, but that was my intention. You're both happy with that? Yes, they are. They're smiling and nodding, Holly. So we'll get onto that. I'll send out, I'll post this and publish this webinar online, and I will send out the slides, which will just be integrated together. So Trish, hi Trish, mentioned before how she firsthand witnessed how well the beloved Birdie fire book was received and how helpful it was in the in Beachmont, which is between me and I think Michelle Holweg's online there. So between the coast and here over at Warwick. So in those bad fires, and it is amazing to see people respond to that. We also provided them, and they were quickly whisked away in the last year's bushfires across the Western and Southern Downs and Toowoomba. Sharleen, I think, knows how popular they are. She has that lived experience. And also the emerging minds information is critical. Like, it's there, it's very important. It gives it's good for workers, it's good for parents and caregivers. It speaks to a different age groups of kids, and it's practical. It's really what people value. Lately at the we did a few get ready events across the state, and they were both the types of resources and QR codes that we shared with parents that they were interested in. Now, I wonder if anyone else has anything out, any questions. Everyone's being...
Just while we're waiting for questions, Anita, I just wanted to flag, so for those people in Queensland, and we will have another mental health activation that's coming on board for the cyclone and flood recovery for far north Queensland. There's also bushfire recovery up there, and severe storm and flooding and bushfires in southeast Western Downs, quite a few areas where we can actually provide the Birdie's Tree storybooks, puppets, all those kinds of things, plus training for free.
Okay.
So please get in touch with us. We want to make sure that people who are in need of these resources get them, and we have funding that provide them. So let's get them out there.
That's exciting, and it's obviously always one of the barriers is having to rely on activations, isn't it, to keep amazing work resources and workers going. But thank you, that's everyone's in love with that idea. So and Brad, the practice guides, that's exciting, launched shortly, and I did hear you say that there's an opportunity for people to partner with you all in the rollout and testing and ongoing livelihood of those practice guides. Yeah.
Definitely.
How is there any particular ideas you have of how that might happen? Do you want people to reach out directly? Do you want us to send out in a week or two a bit of a reminder to people that it's there, and a partnership little launch to people with some ideas of how they might be involved?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think sharing initially the practice guide would be a great step, and then what we're just working on at the moment is forming relationships. I think that's sort of where we'd be keen to lean on sort of jurisdictions a bit as well on. We don't want to sort of be competing or duplicating efforts. So it's looking at what's the best way for us to connect with effort that exists already, or those networks. So, so happy for that to sort of be connected with whoever the right stakeholders are.
All right. Well, everyone be in touch with me. I guess it's a good time to bring things to a close. While I'm just wrapping up, please use the Q&A if you've got any particular feedback of what you found useful about this session, or thanks to our wonderful presenters, Sharleen and Brad. Anything else you'd like to hear feedback? But my wholehearted thanks to you both, Sharleen and Brad, and to my backup agents, Camilla and Sophie, thank you. And to everyone here, thank you for caring enough to prioritise this in your day and join us. And thank you for all of the work that you're